Okay, we have our last presentation for a little while. Those of you who've seen this schedule know we have a break after this until there's a dinner for some folks, and otherwise we have tonight Ryan Lizza and Sasha Eisenberg over in the Great Hall, beginning at 8. 8 sounds right. 8, and that's at 8. So please, everyone, come back to that. That promises to be excellent. But right now we have John Sides and Lynn Vavreck. John is an associate professor of political science at George Washington University. He's also a frequent blogger on multiple platforms. The Monkey Cage, which has won multiple awards as one of the best blogs around, and it probably deserves more awards. It's a fabulous place for bringing political science research in particular to sort of the more public discourse and using what we as political scientists know to inform more public debate about politics. John and his co-author Lynn Vavreck. Lynn is an associate professor of political science at UCLA, and Lynn, much like Seth and Sasha, will have her book available for signing tonight at the event if you are interested in. I suppose you probably could figure out, the two of you, a way to get to sign the PDFs of their forthcoming work, which I believe this talk is going to be based on, entitled "The Gamble." It's a discussion of the 2012 election. Aside from the content of the book, which is fabulous, one of the great things about the book is that Princeton Press is making it available to readers sort of in real time to a certain extent. So 4 chapters are now available as downloadable PDFs on Princeton University Press's webpage. So with that, I'll turn the floor over to John and Lynn, who are going to figure out how they're going to share the presentation. So.
Thanks very much to Dave and to Iowa State and the Harkin Institute for hosting this event. Lynn and I are working on this book about the 2012 presidential campaign, and the reason that we decided to write this book and to write it the way that we're writing it was the view that political scientists are not very visible in the conversation that we have about an election while it's happening and then after. Political scientists are good at weighing in 3 to 4 years later, with no doubt a very well-researched and thoughtful contribution. By that point, if we were to follow that model, we'll be talking about the, Hillary Clinton, Jeb Bush race or something like that, and no one's going to care what we have to say about Barack Obama and Mitt Romney. So Lynn and I started writing the chapters while the campaign was going on, and fortunately, in the first chapter that we released in August, we predicted that Barack Obama was favored to win. So since we weren't embarrassed on Election Day, we decided to keep writing the book. And we have several chapters about the broader economic and political landscape and about the primary that are available. And what we're going to be discussing today primarily is some material from the general election that will be in forthcoming chapters. And you can find the book in your bookstores in September of this year, at the beginning of September. So why should we write a book about the election? Why should political science do this? I think our perception is that we want to offer a perspective on campaigns and elections that's different than what you often get from the post-mortems that are written by journalists and others. You all may be familiar with this book called Dave.
The name of the book after me?
Oh. Dave, yes. Make this. Which one?
No, the USB thing's in. It's lit up. It blinks when I push the button.
Oh, you're adjusting the volume.
Well, that was a different button. I pushed that too. There, now I set it to mute. That's better, right?
Okay,
let's see if we do that.
Oh, there you go.
There we go.
Thank you. Which button? It's on the right?
The top ones are the... Yep.
Okay, thank you. You may remember this book, or you may remember the HBO movie that was broadcast starring Julianne Moore and Woody Harrelson, Game Changed by John Heilemann and Mark Halperin. We doubt that our book is going to be made into an HBO movie. However, I think one of the things that Game Change did was capture very well a certain mode of thinking and writing about an election that's predicated on insider interviews with the principals who are telling the reporters things that happened during the campaign, conversations that are reconstructed from these people's memories and presented as if there was a recording device in the room. There's a lot of things that stylistically distinguish that book from what we're doing, but there's another thing that distinguishes it in terms of perspective, and it's this idea of game change. It's this idea that the campaign is full of moments that we can label game changers. And in fact, in part because I think this book helped introduce this idea into the lexicon, it was one of the top cliche of the 2012 campaign, according to one Florida newspaper that ran down the list. The second ranked cliche was the phrase "double down." And it may interest you to know that the second Game Change book that will be coming out this fall, around the time that ours does, is actually called Double Down, Game Change 2012. So when you look at what happened then in the 2012 campaign, in a lot of the commentary about the election, what you see is, if I may paraphrase Mitt Romney for a moment, binders full of game changers. At one point, a reporter from Other Jones Magazine, using some Google and LexisNexis skills, I presume, counted, I think, 67 different things that were labeled at some point a game changer by a commentator during the election. Some of these will be familiar to you. Others of these may not be familiar to you. Now, I will say this. In fairness, that moment was this reference to Lindsay Lohan's seeming endorsement of Mitt Romney was a facetious blog post by the writer of the Celebritology blog at the Washington Post. So she, in some sense, was embracing this term in a sarcastic way. But if you look at these other things on this list, in particular, the Des Moines Register's endorsement of Mitt Romney. Okay. Or Ann Romney's speech, or Paul Ryan's speech, or other speeches that were given. Now, you go back and you think about those speeches, you say, Ann Romney gave a nice speech. Game changer? Okay, the Des Moines Register endorsed Mitt Romney. Game changer? Like, really? Like, something in Iowa was different as a consequence of this? I mean, it certainly didn't help him win the state. So on the way over in the plane from Los Angeles to Des Moines, Lynn came up with a phrase that I think sort of captures a little bit about what we're arguing at times in this book, which is that a lot of campaign events are what we call game samers. Something happens, but it's pretty much the same after that thing happened as it was before that thing happened. That's not to say that that's true every time, but a lot of these kinds of things, certainly the vast majority of these 67, are game samers, not game changers. So this is a little bit about why we wanted to write this book, to get a different perspective than one that sort of hyperventilates about the latest event that happens in a campaign on a given day. Our approach we liken to Moneyball. If you've read the book by Michael Lewis about the Oakland Athletics, or you've seen the movie starring Brad Pitt and others, you know that Moneyball was the idea that the Oakland A's decided to use quantitative metrics to measure the worth of baseball players in order to find players that no one else had really noticed were talented, that they could get quite cheaply because the Oakland Athletics does not have the payroll of the New York Yankees or the Boston Red Sox. And if you remember the movie, there's a scene where Brad Pitt is sitting around the table with his scouts, and the scouts sort of represent the old school way of doing things, which is just predicated on sort of gut and folklore. And they're talking about this particular pitcher and how he's probably not a very good pitcher because his girlfriend's not very good looking. And you know what they say about pitchers whose girlfriends aren't good looking? They just don't have any confidence. And Billy Beane is just, Brad Pitt is just sitting there sort of rolling his eyes because, is this really a good way of thinking about the quality of the baseball player? So a Moneyball approach, in our view, means using not just the 60-plus years of political science research about campaigns, which helps to focus our attention in the places that we should be looking for campaign effects or maybe not going to find campaign effects, but it also means leveraging as much data as we can muster to speak to the actual things that took place in terms of what the candidates were doing, what the news media was doing, and what voters were doing. So our project is predicated on of a survey project that was conducted by the survey firm YouGov, in which interviewed 45,000 people in December of 2011. Each week during the campaign, they would return to 1,000 of those 45,000 people. So January all the way through the very end of the campaign, they were interviewing a separate 1,000 person sample every week. So we know now what people thought kind of more or less before the general election campaign and much of the primary happened. We know something that they thought during the campaign at some point, depending on when they were interviewed. And then most of these people were re-interviewed in November very briefly just to follow up and ask whether they voted and who they voted for. So 3 interviews over time with these voters. In addition, we have information about the vast number of television ads that aired, something over 1.2 million, that aired during the campaign, when they aired, what they aired. We have some sense of their content. We also have information on 11,000 different news outlets. I didn't read 11,000 different news outlets during the campaign, although sometimes Twitter makes you feel like you are. What we rely on is a company that uses computer algorithms to capture news content by crawling the World Wide Web and finding news sites and bringing in content. So they can count the number of times the word Barack Obama occurred on a particular day across these news outlets. And furthermore, they can characterize whether that coverage was favorable or unfavorable based on the connotations of the words that occurred around the word Barack Obama, the phrase Barack Obama. So, Barack Obama stumbling, Barack Obama controversy, okay, probably connotes a story that's different than Barack Obama rising, Barack Obama succeeding, things like that. Computer algorithms aren't perfect ways of measuring information from the news media. I mean, they're only as good as the computers can be. And no one's suggesting that scientists have created, a computer that's as good as, let's say, the one that can beat, chess masters at chess. But it enables us to get a lot of data very quickly in a way that we think is reliable enough to give us some insight into the process of how the news media makes these decisions and how the information in the news media might influence voters. And I'll show you a little bit of that data in a moment. So that's kind of our approach, our Moneyball approach. And our argument is not that it's the only approach or that it's the best approach, but we think that it provides some value added that you can't get from other kinds of perspectives. So let me talk about our argument a little bit. It starts with the primary, and in the chapters that we've released already, we elaborate this idea. The primary is very much a story about how much the campaign mattered. And the reason for that is that primary elections are very different than the general election that we just witnessed most recently. You have voters in the primary election who aren't really familiar with the candidates for the most part. They don't really know a lot about them. And that's even true sometimes for candidates that have been around for a while. Newt Gingrich, let's say. He disappeared for a long time after he left the House of Representatives for the average voter. And so for him to sort of come back and try to run for president doesn't necessarily mean that everyone remembers everything that happened to him when he was Speaker of the House and prior. So candidates are much less familiar. So information that you hear about them can be that much more influential. And in a primary election, you're also not able to rely on the crutch of your own partisanship, which is so relevant in a general election, as I'll talk about in a moment. So you're a Republican in 2011, 2012, trying to decide amongst a group of candidates, many of which are unfamiliar to you, and just the fact that you're a Republican doesn't help you choose among them, obviously. So here's where news coverage is really important, and the information that you might get from the news media and from the campaigns themselves who are advertising and doing other kinds of work to contact voters is important. Let me give you what this typically looks like in the Republican presidential primary in 2011, 2012, and in many other previous primaries. You have to imagine over time that a candidate's poll standing, represented here by the blue line, starts low, as no one knows who this person is, until some event takes place. And then what happens is sort of I put that in scare quotes a little because, as we'll see, sometimes the things that happen aren't really all that important or meaningful, but because they attract attention from the news media and elsewhere, they attain sort of outsized significance. At other times, things really do happen that are important, but not always. So something happens. News media attention to that candidate is going to spike, increase sharply, and with it, their poll numbers. And we think about this as happening in 3 phases. Initially, there's a period that we call discovery, where a candidate that's been campaigning for months on end all of a sudden gets his or her day in the sun, right? And the news media sort of says, wow, hey, let's talk about this person, right now, because something is different or new or novel about their circumstances. And that goes on, and that's a lovely period for a candidate, because all of a sudden they seem like a front runner, right? And many times they were a front runner by the time this process had played out. They went from single digits to being the front runner in the national polls. And this happened something like 9 or 10 times during the Republican primary campaign, featuring many luminaries such as Donald Trump and others. So then, however, that doesn't last, and it doesn't last for two reasons. One is once you become the front runner, you get attacked. So your opponents start to say nastier things about you, whereas previously they ignored you. And secondly, the news media's job now is something different. Now it's to figure out, okay, here's the front runner in the Republican presidential primary. What do we know about this guy really? And so then all these stories come out that sort of start to find out things that were not known about them before, such as, did they have a ranch in Texas? Yes. So what was at that ranch? A rock. What was painted on that rock at one point in time? The phrase niggerhead. Oh, okay, Washington Post front page. Rick Perry, obviously. So we call that scrutiny. And the scrutiny means that at the height of their news coverage, the tone of the news coverage starts to change. Like, they're still getting a lot of attention, but now the attention is not just, oh, wow, here's this new shiny thing, this new candidate. Now it's like, is this person really that great after all? And oftentimes what then happens is the combination of these attacks and the information that's uncovered starts to make people realize that this person isn't so great after all. And then the news media's attention turns to the next candidate whose turn it is in the sun. Voters follow suit, and the candidate then goes into a long-term decline in their poll numbers. In some cases, never to return again. In other cases, to return again in another cycle of discovery and scrutiny and decline. Rick Santorum had sort of two such cycles, a small one kicked off by the Iowa caucus result, and then a larger one kicked off by his performance in the Missouri, Minnesota, and Colorado caucuses and primaries. But often for many candidates, the decline is the end of the story. So let me give you an example, and I could do several, but I'll do Herman Cain just because, who wants to miss the chance to talk about Herman Cain? Herman Cain's campaigning, and what I'm going to show you now is a graph that charts his media coverage against his poll numbers. There's going to be a gray line that's going to show you, out of all of the mentions of all the Republican candidates in the news media every day, what percentage of those mentions went to Herman Cain. Okay? He's going to spike at almost 80%. And you already know when he spikes at 80%. Okay? There's going to be a black line that's going to show you, okay, if you take that percentage and you weight it by how favorable or unfavorable that coverage is, what does that trend line look like? So, when the trend line's positive, that means he's getting coverage that's on balance positive, and when that trend line dips negative below zero, and as we've scaled it, then that coverage is negative, okay? And that coverage is going to get pretty negative, as you'll see. And then we're going to show you little gray dots that are just his poll numbers in the national polls. And you're going to see how closely these things track, and you're going to see this period of discovery, scrutiny, and decline, and the events that created it. So here's the graph. So there's a little bit of attention to Cain early on. You can see the early spikes in July. But the real event, the main event for him, the real cycle begins in September with the Florida straw poll. And this is why I put the word happens in quotation marks. Because the Florida straw poll, like all straw polls, is a non-binding contest that has no implications for who wins the Republican presidential nomination whatsoever, formally. But Cain wins unexpectedly at a period in which Rick Perry is, in some sense, the dominant candidate in the polls. So you can see the spike of coverage that occurs right at that point, okay, when Cain's happy, okay? And you can see how his poll numbers rise in the immediate aftermath of that spike, okay? Our argument is that people don't wake up in the morning and say, I was a Rick Perry supporter, but today feels like a Herman Cain day, okay? It's not a coin flip, right? Some new information has to happen. They have to perceive that information, hear it, read it, whatever, in order to change their mind. And so this Florida straw poll victory, by the way, which was framed in the following way, okay, and there are 3 different news outlets that said exactly this, and they're quoted in our chapter. Cain upsets Perry. Upsets Perry, right? Not just Cain wins Florida straw poll, but Cain upsets Perry, right, which is a signal about how this is being interpreted and perceived by reporters, okay? It's not just some, victory in a meaningless straw poll. It's a signal of Cain's strength against Perry's weakness. Okay, so here comes Kane's surge in the polls. There's one of the first, the debate where I think he kind of had his sort of most shining moment, 999, that kind of stuff. And you can see the coverage spike, but notice what's happening in the immediate aftermath of that debate, more or less. Do you see that the coverage is still fairly high, but look at the black line starting to go down. I'm talking about right here. This is before what's going to happen, okay? He's already starting to see less favorable coverage. That's the scrutiny. It's coming from his opponents. Romney sort of suggesting that the 999 plan doesn't really hold much water. You know, Romney, for all whatever his challenges might be as a candidate, can sort of see that this is just not particularly effective tax policy. So, you know, there's scrutiny that comes from that, attacks that come from the debates, scrutiny from the news media. Okay, Herman Cain, Godfather's Pizza executive, really? Like this is going to be the nominee? Then come the allegations, as you all know, of sexual harassment from his tenure at the National Restaurant Association, followed not long thereafter by allegations of sexual assault by someone who said that she was attacked or groped by Herman Cain. So now Cain's not as happy. Here he's maxing out, not 80%, but almost 75% of all news mentions. And you can see the coverage is really, really bad because it turns out that in computers, that's funny, when they see, you know, Herman Cain and sexual assault close together in a news story, can kind of internalize that that's not probably very favorable coverage. Okay, so his coverage is really, really negative. You can see the decline in his poll numbers, right? That's occurring as this negative information starts to filter through the electorate. You know, there's one last spike where Ginger White says that, you know, she's had this multiple year affair with him that ended just right before he got his campaign started. And then there's a spike the day he drops out. But at this point, right, his poll numbers are back to where they were, and his candidacy is over, obviously, of his own volition, but in some sense, the voters had also spoken. So this is what discovery, scrutiny, and decline looks like. And we can do this for Perry. We can do this for Gingrich and Santorum. Romney, not as much. Romney is Mr. Steady, okay? Never disappears from the news media, okay? Always there, okay? There's little bumps and wiggles, but he doesn't have the same kind of cycle. And if you want to read those chapters, you can see why we think that's the case, what's different about Romney than these other candidates. But that's what it looks like. That's a campaign effect story, and a big one, okay? In the absence of this kind of information from the news media and from campaigning, voters would definitely think differently about these candidates. But when we get to the general election, the story changes a little bit. Now, when you get to the general election, Seth alluded to this earlier, political and economic fundamentals are more important. The state of the economy is a major influence not only on who ends up running in a campaign and how they campaign, but it's a big influence on who ends up winning. At the same time, voters now have partisanship, right? Most of us have a partisan leaning. The research on the development of partisanship suggests that for many people, it's the same as whatever their parents were. To the extent that there's revision or change to people's party identification, it takes place in their 20s. By the time you get to age 30, give or take, you're going to be what you are for the rest of your life. You're not going to change very much. So partisanship is not just sort of something that people have one day and changes the next day. After a certain point, it's really a permanent part of their identity. So partisanship becomes an important thing that voters use, not just to decide who to vote for. It's in a presidential race, it's not like a race for city council or state legislature where you don't know who the candidates are and all you might have is the D or the R beside their name when you're trying to vote. In a presidential race, you have a lot of information about the candidates. That's certainly true. But what partisanship does in that context is it's a filter on the information that you perceive. And so if you hear negative things about the candidate you favor, you ignore that information or you explain it away or rationalize it. If you hear positive information about the candidate you support, you accept that. Of course, it's true. This guy's so great. So that filtering becomes an important limit on what campaigns can accomplish because no matter what happens, no matter how effectively a candidate campaigns, many voters are just never going to be persuaded by that. The effects of the election and the campaign activity are more muted than in a primary. And the argument that we want to make in this chapter is, these chapters about the general election, is not that means the campaign didn't matter or that the economy determines election outcomes and there's nothing left to say. It's that what happens in a general election campaign in a presidential race is it's very difficult for one candidate to get much of an advantage over the other. Seth alluded to this as well. You have two candidates. I think Romney and allies spent $1.1 billion. Obama and allies spent $1 billion. Now, $100 million is $100 million, but when you're already spending $1 billion, it's not going to buy you that much more. So they were relatively evenly balanced in terms of fundraising, despite all of the conversation about the way in which the Obama campaign was better than the Romney campaign. In many respects, they were fairly well-run, professionalized campaigns. And if that just seems incredible to believe, given what we think about the Romney campaign and the Obama campaign, go back to the primary and look at these primary campaigns. Rick Santorum. No one even knew who was on his staff. I mean, it wasn't clear he had a staff sometimes. He didn't have a pollster. He drove everywhere in his pickup truck. He didn't have funding. That's what, an uncompetitive campaign looks like. In the general election, you've got two very competitive campaigns. And so what often ends up happening is there's a lot of effort going on by both campaigns, but in some sense it's canceling each other out because the campaigns are relatively equally effective. And this is one of the things that I think emerges to some extent from Seth's analysis in these counties where both had field offices, and it didn't seem to be a net advantage for one candidate when they both had some mobilizing presence in these counties. So we want to sort of analogize, and again, I think Lynn came up with this nice metaphor. Oftentimes when you think about a campaign and you're reading sort of commentary about a campaign, it's almost like it's a boxing match, right, where the candidates are landing these blows and we're just waiting for the knockout punch, that one advertisement that's just going to put the candidate on the mat, never to get up again. We would say that a campaign is much more like a tug of war, where you've got two relatively equally strong people pulling on opposite ends of the rope. And the fact that the flag in the middle of the rope isn't moving very much is a testament to how evenly matched the campaigns are. If one of the campaigns were to let go of the rope and say, you know what, raising money and campaigning is a drag, Obama's like, I'd rather go skeet shooting at Camp David or whatever, as he does all the time, quote unquote. Yeah, so, of course Romney's advantage would make a difference. If Romney's going to spend $1.1 billion and Obama's not going to spend anything or spend very little, that's a huge imbalance in effort. But in fact, those kinds of imbalances don't happen very often in a presidential general election campaign. And in reality, there's only two moments in the campaign that were lopsided enough to produce any real substantial movement in the polls. One was the Democratic National Convention. The Republican National Convention might have produced the same effect, but when the conventions are scheduled so close together back to back, at least this was true in 2008 and 2012, the last convention seems to be the most important of the two. In some sense, it overtakes the effect of the first convention, and you never really see what that effect is. And then, of course, the other main lopsided moment was the first debate. But otherwise, the poll's quite stable, and you don't necessarily see big movements in either candidate's direction. That's the consequence of two equally effective campaigns, not the effect of campaigns being ineffective in some sense. So let me just walk through a couple of the arguments that we make about the way that fundamentals mattered in this election, and then Lynn's going to talk a little bit about the advertising and how we sort of think about the effects of these advertisements and why they illustrate this argument about the muted effects of the presidential general election campaign. One of the things that campaigns do is they rally partisans to the cause. So I've already said that partisanship's an important influence in how people vote. But not every partisan's going to start the campaign dead certain they're going to support their party's candidate. Some are going to be wavering a little bit. They're going to be uncertain. They're going to be undecided. And that's catnip for many commentators who really want to think that, oh, my gosh, this is going to be the year the party's fractured. Okay? So if you thought about that, people talked about this in the wake of the Democratic presidential primary in 2008. Will these Hillary Clinton supporters come around to support Obama? They talked about it in 2012. As of April, when Romney basically had consolidated the nomination, there were all these stories about the divided Republican Party. The fact of the matter is the parties are not really all that divided to begin with, and they're increasingly less so as the campaign goes on, because the campaign serves as sort of, it's like the shepherd that brings the sheep back into the fold, okay? So all the wavering, wayward Democrats come back to Obama, wavering, wayward Republicans tend to come back to Romney, and partisanship becomes a stronger influence on how people think about the candidates as the election goes on. Not just the candidates, but also related kinds of things like the economy. People line up their perceptions of all kinds of political phenomena with their underlying partisanship. So let me show you an example of this. What we can do is we can take those people that we interviewed in December 2011 and revisit them again at the end of the campaign in late October. So we have these about 2,000 people that we interviewed in the last 2 weeks of the campaign that we also interviewed in December, well before the general election campaign, well before we knew who the nominee was going to be on the Republican side. And we can compare what these people thought in December and what they thought in October. And here's a graph. On the left-hand side is people's net favorability. Like they evaluated how favorably they felt toward Romney, and they evaluated how favorably they felt toward Obama. And I just took the difference. Okay, so it ranges from being like saying that you think Obama is very favorable about Obama, but not at all favorable about Romney. On the very bottom are people who say they're very favorable toward Romney, not at all favorable toward Obama. People in the middle are neutral or in some sense give candidates the same rating. So you think about December 2011, you can already see how polarized Democrats and Republicans are. And in large part, that's helped by the fact that most of them had an opinion about Barack Obama, and Republicans didn't like him, and they hadn't liked him for most of his presidency. So there's already a lot of polarization, but what you can see over time is the lines get farther apart. The Democrats like Obama more and Romney less. Republicans come to like Romney more, Obama less. Polarization. View of the economy. Is it getting better? Is it about the same, or is it getting worse? Already pretty big differences, okay, between Democrats and Republicans. Independents more similar to Republicans in this case. As the campaign goes on, that changes. In particular, I don't show this demarcation on the graph, but the crucial point really is the Democratic National Convention. Democrats' views of the economy, just in terms of the percent that say better, grows by about 12 points in the 2 weeks after the Democratic National Convention. This is what conventions do. Rah, 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 right? They make people feel good about the party. And that translates into these other kinds of perceptions. So the objective economy didn't change. This occurred before that jobs report, that the unemployment ticked down 0.3 of a percentage point, and Jack Welch tweeted out that this was a conspiracy by the Obama administration to manipulate the numbers, and we had a whole debate about whether that was true, which of course it wasn't. So this is before any real change in the objective economy, right? People's perceptions change. Republicans, of course, went the opposite direction. Okay. They were not persuaded by that jobs report. Let's just put it that way. Okay. So that's polarization there. This is just vote intention, whether you said Obama, Romney, or you weren't sure. And again, most voters early on knew how they'd vote in a Romney-Obama matchup, even when it was hypothetical. But of course, as the campaign goes on, Democrats gravitate toward Obama, Republicans gravitate toward Romney. That's the partisan polarization. This is what the campaign period itself is doing, is activating people's sort of partisanship, their partisan leanings. This is what makes voters somewhat predictable in a general election. You know where they're going to end up, even months ahead of the election, in part based on what they already think about the parties. Let's talk a little bit about the economy. One of the things that the campaign period also does is it makes the economy more salient to voters. So think about the information that voters are going to encounter during a campaign as sensitizing them to the fundamental conditions in the country and making them more strongly relate their intentions about voting to their views about the economy, for example. And so we can do that by looking at how strongly people's perceptions of the economy predicted their vote intention over the course of the campaign. The advantage of having interviewed people in December is we know what they thought about the economy before the campaign really happened. And so we can leverage that early reading of the economy as a way to mitigate what some of you might already be thinking about. Wait a minute, didn't Sides just tell us that people line up their views of the economy with their partisanships? And now he's telling us that the economy is driving their vote. Wait a minute, what's the cart and what's the horse here? What's the chicken, what's the egg? Because we have a measurement of people's views of the economy before a lot of the general election campaigning, we at least have some ability to mitigate this kind of reverse causality and actually get at what is the relationship between the economy and how people end up choosing how they want to vote. So we can map that relationship over time, and the higher the number I'm going to show you, the more strong that relationship is. So this is a graph that captures the effect of the economy. I haven't told you exactly what 0.2, 0.3, 0.4 means because it's a statistical number that is irrelevant in terms of its literal meaning. But what's more important is just the direction of the trend and how much more the economy was important by June when we lined up this race, so we knew who these guys were, okay, and the nomination was known, than it was in January. Even controlling for people's party identification and doing our best to deal with the potential reverse causality of your vote intention causing your economic perceptions. After about June, July, it doesn't actually change very much, which is interesting because it suggests that a lot of the general election campaigning didn't necessarily do much to add to this. And in fact, we also tried to see if it was different in battleground states and non-battleground states, thinking maybe it's all the advertisements and all the kinds of communication you get in battleground states, and that didn't seem to make the difference. It seems just to be the more general sort of nationalized information that you get about the campaign that helps to produce this increasing relationship. Okay, so this is a take on why the fundamentals become more important during the campaign as a whole. So the campaign is doing something here, right, that's important. It's not just the economy matters, end of story. The campaign is doing something important. But the end result of that is that the campaign the election ends up looking like what we would predict based on the fundamental conditions in the country. So I'll show you a graph that political scientists like to make a lot. What we try to do is we say, okay, we take an economic statistic and look at how much that economic statistic changes in the election year. And even early in the election year, we're going to look at the first 6 months of 2012. It turns out that people's perceptions of the economy are very sort of short-term, very myopic, very nearsighted. They remember what's happened recently much better than they remember what happened 4 years ago or 3 years ago. This is why Reagan gets reelected in 1984 when the unemployment rate was 7.3%, right? Well, the reason he gets reelected is because 2 years prior to that, the unemployment rate was 10.3%. That trajectory, right, downward trajectory in unemployment, the improving economy coming into the election year was really important for making 1984 Morning in America, as his campaign referred to it. So we're looking at the change in gross domestic product, which is an overall measure of the size and health of the economy from January through July of 2012. Then you plot that against how well the incumbent party does. So when the incumbent party is running in a bad economy, they tend to do worse than when they're running in a good economy. We punish the incumbents for the economy for better or worse, even if they're not in total control of the economy. That's what tends to happen. So what we did is we looked at this relationship between 1948 and 2008. And then we said, okay, based on what we know from 1948 to 2008, what would we predict, okay, for 2012, and then where does 2012 end up? So let me show you what that graph looks like. So on the horizontal axis, you can see the percentage change in GDP over the first 2 quarters of the election year. You can see years when the economy was bad, 2008, 1980, just to show you that this measure has some comports with what we understood intuitively. You can see the percentage that the incumbent party gets. So the line there captures that relationship, that upward sloped relationship, meaning the better the economy does, the more it grows, the better the incumbent party does. So that line is based on 1948 through 2008. So then we just put 2012 on there, and it's right on the line. Meaning, if we had known nothing else about this election other than this one economic statistic, we could have predicted the outcome very well 6 months before the election actually happened. Now, caveat, that's a little lucky, right? You can see there's some years in which the candidate does better or worse than we would predict based on the economy. Economy is not the only thing that matters. GDP is not the only economic statistic that's relevant. And I'm not arguing that people know what the GDP is. I'm just saying it's a measure of something that's imminent in their environment in terms of the information they get about the economy. So with those caveats there, we're not trying to overclaim what we can do based on with forecasting elections with economic indicators. But it's certainly the case that 2012 was not out of line with that historical relationship with this one economic indicator. So the reason that Lynn and I were able to predict the outcome relatively accurately in a chapter that was released in August and written in June was in part because this proved to be true in 2012. So that's our story about political and economic fundamentals, their importance, and how the campaign helps to make them more important. Now Lynn can talk to you about Obama's advertising.
Okay, so you look at a picture like this, and you might say, well, there's not a lot of room for the campaign to matter. On or above the line, we're getting those elections right, and there just aren't very many elections that we get wrong if we use this prediction. And so the question is, how much can the campaign actually shake the outcome off of these robust predictions about the outcome? And if you listen to a lot of coverage of campaigns, you will think that the campaign will affect this a lot, right? And reporters and pundits and analysts are looking for that knockout punch. So we want to try to figure out whether there are any knockout punches and what potential things like advertisements, campaign field offices, and all of this sort of stuff, news coverage in the general election what can they possibly do to shake this outcome? Okay, so here's a quote from Charlie Cook talking about the campaign strategy and the tactics and the potential for effects. So he says, the Obama campaign's decision to roll the dice by spending an enormous amount of money to discredit Romney in the swing states, right? That is a game changer. This could be the thing that we are going to credit for Obama's victory, and the decision in the summer by the Romney team not to define Romney in a personal and positive way. Okay, so two things Charlie Cook is saying that are squarely in the set of campaign strategy moves, right? The Romney team's decision not to define Romney in a personal way, in a positive way, to only attack Obama. And then the Obama's campaign's decision to, in Ryan's piece on this, he quoted Messina as saying that it was a grand bet, right? Grand bet. So was this gamble consequential, and should the victory be credited? Charlie Cook, who we think is one of the best analysts in Washington, thinks that these two possible decisions were game changers. Okay, so we'll start with the advertising. What we've got for you here, from January through to Election Day, the volume of advertising by candidate. So these data come from the Campaign Media Analysis Group via the Washington Post, and they're collecting all of the presidential campaign ads aired by candidates and groups and parties. So we have separated them into pro-Republican and pro-Democratic sides. And what you can see is, wrong button. Okay, let's go back. What you can see is that in the beginning of the year, there's basic parity, not very much advertising and very equal, until we get into this spring and summer when Romney essentially becomes the de facto nominee. And this period is what we are going to call this early ad blitz that Charlie Cook referred to, the Bain period. And it starts technically on June 16th or 20th is the first ad about Bain. But there's a little bit of ramping up that's happening in May. But you can see that even during this time, during the grand bet, right, when the Obama campaign was doing this unprecedented blitz, the Romney campaign is right there trying to hang in. They're being out advertised. But it isn't as if they're not advertising at all. Okay, so again, I'm going to probably say this more times than you want to hear, but I teach a lot of freshmen, so here we are. If there's not a lot of variation between what the two of them are doing, it's going to be really hard for us to find a big effect. And so even during this period that is supposed to produce the Obama strategy move that leads to his victory, we can see that the Romney campaign is right there pulling on the rope in the other direction equally as hard. Okay, and then we go forward. We have some heavy advertising by the Romney team during his trip to the Olympics. And then the conventions, typically campaigns would not advertise during the conventions, but the Obama campaign stays on the air. The Romney campaign clearly missed that memo. And then we ramp up into the general election, and slight amount of increase in advertising by the Romney campaign at the end. They're going to be out advertising the Obama campaign in the last couple of days. Okay, so that's what the pattern of advertising looks like. There aren't a lot of big differences. This is what it looks like using GRPs instead of advertisements. A GRP is a gross ratings point. It is a Nielsen measure of an ad's penetration. So it tries to get at exactly how many eyeballs, how much of the population is seeing these advertisements. These data are from Nielsen, and they show basically the same pattern. I'm only showing you June through the end of the year here, not all the way from January. But here's this period of ramping up where Obama is slightly out advertising Romney, but even during the Bain ad blitz, again, in terms of gross ratings points, we're not seeing a whole lot of Obama domination. One of the things that comes out of the GRP data is this sense of a conversation between the two campaigns. So a lot of the patterns look like this. The Romney campaign has a spike in advertising, and then the Obama campaign has a spike. And then Romney will spike, and then Obama will spike. And so it looks a lot like a sine wave. They're sort of whether they're reacting to one another's ad buys or this is just the natural ebb and flow and they happen to not be in sync. There's an interesting set of work to be done in just thinking about how these things emerge. But you can see the period during the Olympics and the conventions, and then the surge there to the end to Election Day. One other little interesting fact about the ad buys, all these are the individual data points on the bottom. This is a smooth line through the data, so you can see the trend. But these dots along the bottom, if I drew the lines and connected these in the time order for you, you would see something that looks like a sewing machine. So there'd be up, 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 and then down, and then up, 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 and down, and it would be very regular in that way. These are the weekends. So if I label them by days of the week, there's a massive decrease in advertising by both campaigns throughout most of the period on the weekends. So they, for some reason, think we're not watching television on the weekends. Okay. So these, and that's actually not a new thing. You see that in every campaign, whether it's for House or Senate or governor, they don't advertise on the weekends. Okay, so the summer ad blitz by Obama, was this the thing that we can credit for his victory? Some of you may remember this ad called Firms. This was the ad where Mitt Romney was singing America the Beautiful. And the ad claims that Romney's part of the problem, not part of the solution. He has shipped jobs from Mexico to Mexico and China. He has a bank account in the Cayman Islands. All sorts of implications that he has money that he's trying to hide. So this is the flavor of what was happening in the summer from mostly a group called Americans for Prosperity, but some from the Obama campaign itself as well. So we're going to try to see whether that really is the game changer. And here we are, June and July, right here. So here's the period we're talking about. And what I'm showing you is overall favorability using the data that John described for Obama and Romney. And so if we were going to say, do you see a knockout punch? Okay, all you can really say is that you see a slight increase in Romney favorability in the middle of these 2 months. So shortly after the ad blitz starts, Romney actually looks like he's doing a little bit better, but that decays very quickly and he's right back to where he started. There's not much going on for Obama during this period. So I would say best case scenario, game same, right? This is not a game changer. Now, it may have had effects on other things that they cared about. So in Ryan's piece, one of the things that they're talking about is raising money. And maybe these advertisements did a little partisan activation, got people to open their wallets, and helped them raise money. But in terms of the election outcome, which is what Charlie Cook is talking about, it would be hard to say from this pattern that those advertisements really helped Obama very much. Okay, the early ads again, battleground states, non-battleground states. Okay, so here's this period again that we're looking at. And it seems like, in fact, this is Romney favorability only. That surge that we saw in the previous graph was dominated by people who live in the battleground states, where the advertising mostly was. Okay, so even perhaps some indication that if the ads had any effect at all, they backfired a little bit on Obama, and that the effect was to increase Romney's favorability in the battlegrounds, but again, a very rapid decay. And then we're back to just kind of the same effects, battleground and non-battleground. You know, this isn't totally bizarre or contrarian. You may remember that when these ads came out, there was a lot of coverage about whether the attacks were fair. And the Firms ad that I showed you was fact-checked, and they, you know, the fact-checker people gave it a liar, liar, pants on fire. I think it's that one. It was the claim was that somewhere in all of this is the claim that Romney was still responsible for Bain even when he left to go to be CEO of the Olympics, that people really thought that was not a true claim. led people to draw a misleading inference. So all the fact checker people were hard on Obama for making that claim in the ad. So he's getting a pretty decent amount of negative news coverage during this period when it's supposed to be the ad blitz that helps him win the election. Perhaps this is an effect of that news coverage, not so much the ads. But whatever it is, it's very short-lived. If these ads were going to be a game changer, right, we'd expect to see some kind of an effect of Romney favorability that is declining, but then continually declining, right? So if we want to say that this is the knockout punch, the reason Obama won, we would not expect Romney's favorability to go up. We expect it to go down, and then we'd expect it to kind of go down to a level that was consequential. Okay, so not what we see. All right, but the fact that all of these pictures that I'm showing you are flat, these are basically flat lines throughout the entire period. Okay, so the fact that I'm going to call these the top line results are flat, and vote choice will look pretty much the same way, doesn't mean that nothing is happening and that the campaigns are irrelevant. John said, we're not going to sit here and tell you that, that the campaigns don't matter. I'm slightly concerned that the graph that I was going to show you on this isn't coming up. I thought maybe it was taking a second to load. Yeah, that's so. What I was going to show you was that if you separate out the populations that you think would be the most susceptible to campaign nudges, like independents who don't have a party to go back to, or undecided voters, you can see over time some of these. Oh, thank you, yes. Some of these things actually moving the independent and undecided voters. So even though the top line result is flat, what's happening underneath the surface is that independents and undecided voters are moving, but often in opposite directions. So, for example, after the Democratic convention, John mentioned that seemed to be a moment where something happened in the electorate. A lot of independents and undecided voters decided they were going to vote for Obama, but that's about 40% of them. Another 40% said, hey, I'm going to vote for Romney. So there's a lot of movement in those people, but the movement tends to cancel out, making that top line result flat. Okay, so that was the still waters run deep part of this. We call that dynamic equilibrium. What you see looks like an equilibrium result, but underneath there's a lot of dynamics going on. So the campaign is affecting the outcome by keeping the trend flat. Okay, so did these early ads, can we find any evidence that the early ads mattered? We're going to push now from looking at aggregate results to looking at the individual level. So we marry these advertising data with our survey data. We know where these people live, we know what media market they're in, we know the day they were interviewed, we know how much each candidate advertised on the day our person was interviewed. So we match all that up, and we're going to do this test. Did the advertising in the media market where you live on the day you were interviewed affect your vote choice? Okay, so this is a model that I've used before in previous presidential elections and some House and Senate elections. And in those previous results, we have found a very rapid decay. So there's an effect from the ads, but it goes away really fast, just like the aggregate results that I showed you. And when we ran this on our data for 2012, we found out that, yeah, there's a small effect of these Bain ads in helping Obama, so increasing his vote share, but it doesn't last very long. In fact, we think about a day. So the effect is about so here's a way to think about it. If Obama could out-advertise Romney in your media market by a 2-to-1 ratio, so he doubles Romney's ads, okay, that's going to boost his vote share by about 2 points. Okay, so Seth told you earlier about the effect of field offices in a county being about 1/3 of a point. And now I'm telling you that to get 2 points, you've got to double the other guy's advertising. Okay, so the campaign effects are small. Okay, small doesn't mean that they're not consequential, but they're not double-digit effects. So this is actually a pretty good-sized effect. but you've got to double your ad advantage. But most of this effect is gone within a day. And this size advantage was not terribly common. If we look at all of the days of the campaign in the 210 media markets in the country, okay, only 25% of them were days on which Obama had a 2-to-1 advantage over Romney. And the number of days where Romney had this advantage over Obama is actually much smaller than 25%. Okay, so most of the time their advertising is really close to parity. So those effects are not going to be very big. To give you a sense of the decay, this is a picture from the previous work I did. This is the 2000 election. And these are just giving different shapes to the decay function, but the one that works the best is this one right here. And it's one of the more steep decays. And what you're looking at here is the number of days since the advertisement ran. So here's the day it runs. On the day an ad runs, we think that, of the impact, it's going to have 100% impact on the day it runs. Okay, that's its best shot. By 5 days out, what's left of that impact? About 30-some%. 10 days out, 20-some. And when you get to, 40 days out, you're down to 10 or 8%, and that just keeps decaying. So some of it persists for a long time, but most of the effect of the ad is gone within a couple days. This is in 2000. Okay, so what it seems like we're seeing in 2012 is even a faster decay. So the idea that these early Bain ads were going to be the thing that led to the Obama victory strains a little bit of believability. There's very little chance that something that happened in June and July in terms of advertising, that the effects of that thing were going to last until Election Day. Okay, so here's Axelrod telling us, though, that that's probably what happened. The campaign made a strategic decision to spend more heavily from May to August with the belief that campaign ads become less effective closer to elections. Okay, by September, people are disregarding ads. They backloaded, we front-loaded. Okay. There is no political science evidence that shows this is true. Okay? In all of the political science evidence on the effects of advertising, and it's not all done by me, show that, in fact, the opposite is true. For advertising to be effective, it has to be done very close to Election Day. Okay, so then on November 10th, this is what he said on November 27th. Prior to that, on November 10th, Axelrod says, sort of exactly the opposite. What's been interesting to watch is that our data is remarkably consistent. So he's saying that we had a 2-point effect in the battleground states, and we kind of held that throughout. By and large, we've been 3 and 4 points ahead in the battleground polls. Okay, so he's contradicting himself a little bit here, saying that it was the early ads that were the game changer for them, but that basically their top-line result held constant over the course of the campaign. And what we're saying is that this is much closer to what the data show than this is. Okay, which brings me to the final point about why there are these competing explanations for what happens in presidential campaigns and why we thought our voice was relevant to the conversation. It's important to think about people's incentives. The people who talk about these things have very different incentives. So for Axelrod, who is with the winning campaign, right, his incentive is to say, our great strategy won this, right? Why does he want to say that? Because he wants to work again, okay? So, we ran a great campaign. We made this great strategic decision. It was a grand bet, okay, and look how smart we were. For Stuart Stevens with the Romney campaign, right, he's on the losing side. For Mitt Romney, what are they going to say? Well, they're going to say, the Obama campaign ran a great campaign. We were out-campaigned, we admit it, blah, blah, blah. We made one strategic mistake. Because what they can't say is, we lost because our ideas suck, right? Mitt Romney is not going to say that. The Republicans are not going to say, the other guy beat us because his ideas are better. Because people like their ideas better than our ideas. Their solutions are more effective than no loser's ever going to say that. So anything you hear coming from either side, the winning or the losing side, right, is typically driven by the fact that the explanation for the win and the loss almost has to be strategic, something in the campaign. Obama, when he talks, right? Now, he has no incentive to say his campaign was the deciding factor because he won, and he can say, we have a mandate, our ideas are good, the American public has spoken, they want our solutions, right? But his campaign manager will say something else, okay? Obama rarely credits the campaign. We made a great strategic decision. Those early ads were you're never going to hear him say that, okay? And then what about political reporters? Their incentives are also very different. So, maybe we can get Sasha to talk about this a little bit, but when you're a reporter covering a campaign day to day, and your job is to chronicle what happened today, it's probably a great way not to get noticed to write the same story every day. Right? That would probably not be great. And even if the same thing is happening every day, and if you've ever traveled around with a campaign, you know that basically the same thing happens every day. Okay? Same stump speech, same thing. And you're waiting for something interesting to happen, but you can't write the same story every day. Okay? So you have to write about what's happening with an angle on something interesting or different. Okay? So I thought, since we're going through the incentives of everybody writing about elections, what are our incentives? So as academics, we come to this with a completely different set of incentives. Our incentives are to be taken seriously by our colleagues and peers, but also by the people who read our work who are not in the academy. And so to us, that means to be honest about what we see in the data, to collect data that will answer the questions we're trying to answer. A good friend of mine says, they don't give Nobel Prizes to people who ask questions that can't be answered, right? You have to ask answerable questions. So we want to frame things in a way where we can gather some data that can give us purchase on these things, where we can have some answers, and then be honest about the patterns we uncover. And the honest answer is that we don't see a lot of movement in the top line result, the vote share result. We see some movement underneath that from a small set of susceptible voters, but 92% of the Democrats who told us in December of 2011 that they would vote for Barack Obama voted for Barack Obama among likely voters. And 93% of the people who told us they were going to vote for Romney in December voted for Romney. So $3 billion of campaigning is going after a very small chunk of the electorate. All the effects are going to be small. And that's it. We're happy to answer your questions.
I don't know if that mic works.
Me neither. So.
Go ahead. Sasha Eisenberg, Jones. I'm also questionable not getting the Nobel Prize. Were you asking in the second interview attribute questions about the candidates?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, so one of the sort of ways that political professionals talk about what they're doing in terms of opinion formation, I think, is the still waters run deep, not only in terms of there being demographic groups or subsamples of whose movement will be obscured, but that under the top line that you might not, on the day you run an ad or in the immediate aftermath, move the horse race or even somebody's favorability number, but that you either change impressions of them on do they understand the problems like you, particular issue dynamics, both as a matter of changing those things in the short term in a way that contributes to long-term impressions of the candidate's favorability, or in ways, and I think this is sort of relevant to your other writing on messaging, Lynn, in ways that sort of hems in their ability to change the subject or shift the agenda or to sort of strategically determine what the race is about at a later date. And so there's an impression certainly within the Obama campaign that the horse race might not have moved when those ads ran, but that they did change impressions of Romney in a way that limited his ability over the subsequent 5 months to change impressions, change opinions, either on the ballot or favorability.
Yeah. And I mean, I do think there's something to that story. Imagine, being in the Obama campaign and you watch the Republican primary unfold and you hear Rick Santorum and Newt Gingrich talking about how rich and out of touch Mitt Romney is. They started this during the GOP nominating process. And you sort of say, like, this is really they can look at the data and they can see that that has traction, and so they say we're going to pick this up. And then, like, at the same time that you're going to do this ad blitz and pick this up, you know, the guy goes to the Olympics and offends the mayor of London, and, you know, makes a comment that his wife has 2 Cadillacs, and he likes NASCAR too. He knows many of the owners, and it's like, you know. And I do think that stuff like that taken together, reinforcing the narrative that Mitt Romney is out of touch. I do think stuff like that can be very powerful. In terms of what we see in the data, there are 2 patterns that are worth talking about with this. I'm going to talk about one. I'm going to let John talk about the other one. The first is that when I look for the effects of these advertisements instead of on vote share, on a dependent variable that measures how sincere people think Mitt Romney is, we do see effects. But again, they decay really rapidly. So these...
People revert to thinking he's authentic?
Yeah, if we looked at the time series on that, would we see? I can't answer that question right now. Whether we see, John's going to answer it. Whether we actually see it bounce back, but the second is that on the question of does this candidate care about the rich? Does he care about the poor? Does he care about people like me? We see basically no movement in that over time. So these ads don't touch that, even though you'd think that might be the thing that they touch the most. But on the sincerity thing, you're not actually looking at it.
No,
you're tweeting something. He's tweeting something.
I'm not tweeting a thing. We asked, YouGov asked, and we asked. There's several questions that get at these kinds of impressions. Sincerity gets it. Does the candidate say what they believe, or do they say what they think voters want to hear? There's a general favorability measure. There's also a measure just how likable do you think the candidates are. Those were asked almost every week starting in February. We also asked, does the candidate, how well does each of the following describe Barack Obama? How well do they describe Mitt Romney? Cares about people like me, cares about the poor, cares about the middle class, cares about the wealthy. Okay, Obama has advantages on these items. Right? Democrats typically have advantages on these items. This is not just Obama. Right? Go back, well into the 80s when these questions started being asked in polls, and Democrats are the party of empathy. Right? They care about people like you. So what we find in terms just of the top overall numbers is that Obama's advantage in cares about people like me was almost identical the weekend before the election as what it was in a poll conducted January 7th through 10th. Right on the right after the first attacks on Romney's time at Bain Capital started by Newt Gingrich, before in some sense those attacks probably could even fully penetrate the electorate. Our sense, just in terms of the trends, is that they're very flat for the most part. I think Lynn's point about the dynamics that we can observe with the advertising is, in some sense, you can observe an effect of an imbalance of advertising on these perceptions, but first of all, that effect's going to disappear because advertisement effects are like ibuprofen. They go away quickly. Although advertising is not really a pain reliever as much as it is a pain causer, but you know what I mean. And it's also true because the balance of advertising itself is changing day to day. Where Obama's up and Romney's up and Obama's up and Romney's up, and even if it's not changing day to day, it's still not going to. You're not going to have a durable advantage, in every media market that's large enough to create a lasting impact, for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. And so it's the conversation that Lynn alluded to earlier is also part of that explanation. To me, my last thought is that, the argument I guess that you can make is that, and the argument that we have to confront, I think, in the book and that people confront us with is that, in the absence of a conversation about Bain Capital, something would have been different for Mitt Romney. That's probably true. But first of all, that conversation was, in the absence of conversation about Bain, there's going to be a conversation about Bain Capital. So in some sense, it's a silly hypothetical. The question is whether over the long term, having that conversation appear and reappear because of what Republican candidates did, because of what Obama did, because of what Romney did to himself, is that reinforcing a perception? It may be. It's hard to measure reinforcement, which is to say, how confident or strongly do you believe something? Your overall answer never changes, but maybe something underlying your conviction changes, and we can't measure that. The Romney people also feel that every time they had to talk about this, it kept them from saying something else. Now, my view is, the week of conversation that we had about the 47% video, which is when that news coverage was really, really salient, was a week they like to get back, but it's not a game changer to have that week happen. And the fact that Romney was able to bounce back, seemingly, from that video and have impressions of him improve so rapidly as a consequence of the first debate just suggests to me that there's not as much of a lingering residue that comes about because of this conversation about his wealth and his business experience that he can't undo himself. To me, the interesting question that comes out of that first debate and the effects that first debate had is maybe there was some room for people to change their opinions of Romney as a person and come to see him more favorably. And if the Romney campaign had made a more concerted effort to do so, right, that's the counterfactual I'm kind of curious about. If they had said, okay, this is not just an election where we're going to attack Barack Obama for not creating enough jobs, this is an election where we're going to introduce you to this wonderful, generous, upstanding man. By all accounts, all of those things are relatively accurate descriptions of him in some respects. Certainly he's extremely honorable and charitable in various ways. Maybe that might have been enough to change to some extent the impressions that you're talking about, Sasha. So I would be willing to give some weight to that, to a counterfaction in which Romney's strategy is a little bit different. But I'm not quite sure that this attack on the Bain Capital stuff was central to what ended up happening. I don't know, Lynn, if you would agree with all
I was
that.
just
We're also sometimes sort of hashing out our own
it's very helpful for us.
disagreements, sometimes on these things.
One of the things the Romney people said to us that I thought was really interesting and really important was in talking about this result. We've been sort of having this conversation with them about this. And they said, well, okay, yeah, but any time that something your opponent does takes the opportunity for your candidate to go somewhere with voters, anything that your opponent does that takes that off the table is bad for you. And what they meant was, when Obama does all of this, the line may stay flat. It may actually look like it's not affecting people at all, even at the individual level, but it's reinforcing this idea that people have about Romney in such a way that now all those undecided voters and independents out there who Romney may have been able to attract into his fold there, now they're sort of saying, yeah, I'm not going to move off of my slight preference for Obama. It takes it off the table. That's not a Nobel Prize winning question.
Or people who haven't decided whether they're favorable or undecided on the favorability question don't necessarily become unfavorable about it, but foreclose effectively.
Don't move, yeah.
Don't move,
yeah.
The likelihood of them eventually becoming favorable
Yeah.
to him decreases, right?
And I thought that was interesting and an important consideration. I wanted to do a little better job on your question about does the effect of the ads, when you asked me, does it really go away? Do they bounce back? And what I'm actually trying to say is that when I look at the effect of the ads in your media market, the ads on the day I interview you affect you, but yesterday's ads in your media market don't affect you at all. So yesterday's ads, the ads the day before, have no effect, but the ads on the day closest to your interview do affect you. And that's what I mean when I say that, what happened yesterday is old news. Yeah.
Is there any connection between, I can see this, the idea of you broadcast ads now so that later the effect would be easier to manipulate. Is there any evidence of kind of the ads yesterday making the effect size of an ad today bigger? Do you see more ads later on after a media blitz have a larger effect than ads that don't have a kind of precursor?
You mean like ads on the same topic?
Yeah, so you have an ad yesterday about Maine that moves you up, and then you have this same quality or same volume of ads on Maine again the next day. Is the effect size larger on the second day than on the first day?
Yeah, we can't. We did not separate out the effects by content of the ad, so I can't tell you that.
I mean, this is a really hard question to answer. And you have to sort of imagine, you have a measure that's like volume of advertising about Bain, volume of advertising about everything else. Those two things are really highly correlated.
You could think of just looking at volume of advertising, right? If ads have an effect on favorability ratings generally, could have a pro-Obama ad that's going to have an effect on Obama's favorability. Would a subsequent pro-Obama ad the next day have a larger effect than the previous day before?
Just because, so in some sense, Friday's ad makes Saturday's ad more effective?
Yes, because it's recalling something as opposed to learning something.
If there were momentum dynamics, right, you might think so. I mean, the best we can tell is there is no momentum dynamic, right? Friday's effects is mostly washed away. Saturday's effect happens, but that's gone on Sunday, mostly gone on Sunday. So there doesn't seem to be this kind of accumulation. I mean, I think what Lynn was hearing, what I was hearing in your question was something that's even really harder for us to test, and I'm going to channel Axelrod again. Axelrod believes that, a lot of consultants believe that what you're doing in an election is you're telling a story, and the sequence of storylines matters. And so in their view, you soften up Romney with this Bain stuff in the summer, right, to make the case that he's not a good steward of the economy. You can't trust him to deal with these issues later on. So he's out of touch, elitist, plutocrat, outsourcer, right, rich guy. And then you pivot, right, and you're like, this is the guy that's going to help, you in your life, and bring us jobs, or do you trust Obama to do that? So you pivot from just Romney's a bad rich guy to Obama's better at doing this crucial task, which is improving the health of the economy. In Axelrod's view, A happens, that makes B work. You can't do it any other way. We don't have any way of figuring out if that's true or not. We can't replay the campaign and do B and then A, or do the B and A simultaneously. I mean, a little bit of that narrative is oversold because they are doing A and B simultaneously. Okay, they're doing a lot of jobs ads in the splits in May, June, and July. The Bain stuff is mainly in July, and that's only a fraction of the total Obama advertising. Right? So the campaign just never affords us opportunities to isolate the effects of some of these kinds of things. That means that part of being honest, I think, as Lynn said in the concluding slide, is saying this is what we can't address. These are things we can't address with the data at hand. So it doesn't mean that David Axelrod is wrong. He might be right. We don't have a good way of testing that. But I think it also, being honest, also probably means that Axelrod should admit that he doesn't know either, right, what would have happened. I mean, they have their focus group and their survey data that speak to whether people like their advertising or not. But that's not dispositive. And it doesn't rise, I mean, we can't rise to the level of social science that we'd like to, where all of this stuff is being randomly assigned and it's a nice clean experiment. They can't do that either, and they didn't do enough of that just because they're running a campaign, not a science experiment. So ultimately, I think we're a little skeptical, but I concede I can't do as much as I would like or we would like to get at these kinds of hypotheses. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Diane Westrom, and I direct the Center for Women in Politics here at Iowa State, and I also study political advertising
Awesome.
from a political communication standpoint, and teach the political campaigns here every once in a while. One of the things, kind of tying these panels together, one of the questions I got a lot this year, not only from reporters, but also from students in my class, because there were, $7 or $8 billion spent on campaign advertising this year. Why do campaigns spend this much money? And then secondly, one of the things that we talked about, because of the way things happened this year, will campaigns be moving more money from advertising into mobilization efforts? Because that was also, I think, conventional wisdom that Obama won this year because he had not only all this advertising, but all these great mobilization efforts. So I guess my question for you is that, do you think that political campaigns, they obviously think that ads work, and there's evidence from research that they do have at least small effects. So do you think in the next cycle we'll see this amount of money spent on political advertising, or are you predicting more of a movement into money spent on mobilization?
I'm gonna go first, and then I'll let John give his answer. I think the spending on the ground campaign in the field offices is a luxury good that campaigns can afford to purchase because they don't have limited spending anymore. And if it came back next cycle and we said each of you can only spend X amount of dollars, all of that money would be spent on campaign advertising. I don't think there's a campaign professional out there who would say, I'm not going to advertise, I'm only going to have field offices. So I think this is a new world of campaigning where there's no spending limit. We can raise as much money as we can spend, and sometimes more than we can spend. And we're going to do everything. We're going to max out in every dimension, and we don't have to make these trade-offs. They bought all the advertising time they could buy, both campaigns. The Romney campaign bought in Pennsylvania in the last 3 days, that blip at the end, and people wrote like, Romney thinks Pennsylvania is competitive, he's buying ads in Pennsylvania, and they told us there was literally nowhere else for them to buy advertising, so they bought it. They had money to spend, and they didn't have any.
He had $12 million he didn't spend. Romney.
So so I think the answer to that is that no, I don't think advertising is going away.
Why do campaigns spend this kind of money? So back to the tug of war. You're always afraid of letting your opponent get an advantage, lest in that start to move the rope. So this is an arms race dynamic that you see in the Cold War with the buildup of nuclear weapons. We have many more nukes than we needed to kill each other many times over. Why do we keep building? Because we're afraid of the gap. We're afraid of the missile gap. The only way to really solve this kind of problem is to somehow get the candidates to agree or to coordinate on a spending limit. That's what public funding was meant to do in presidential campaigns. Candidates now have blown that system up. So it really would have to come down to, pardon the gender-specific language, especially for you, but a gentleman's agreement about not spending more than X dollars or what have you. And if you could trust your opponent to live up to that, right, and not break the promise, Obama was never gonna. He was like, oh, yeah, I'm not going to, I'll accept public funding. He was all like, oh, okay. Oh, I hate super PACs, right? Oh, yuck. I'm going to criticize the Supreme Court at the State of the Union address, right? But you don't want to disarm unilaterally, right? So you raise the money you need to raise above the cap. You don't take public funding. You let the super PAC raise money and spend on your behalf. Now he's converting Obama for America into a 501c4 to play that game, right? So now dark money, no donor disclosure. People play by the rules is what the rules allow them to do. And I don't see a way to change that without either putting new rules in place, which are unlikely given the current configuration of the Supreme Court, or having candidates who are somehow able to bind themselves to these kinds of agreements.
And there was an effort this year in the Massachusetts race, if it was that they even, I'm in the middle of analyzing that race now, they said that they weren't going to take any outside money or anybody that came in and advertised from the outside. They were going to donate that amount of money to.
Yeah, they didn't want outside independent spending. Yeah. They certainly took outside donations from people who didn't live in the state of Massachusetts. So that's a good example of how this is so hard. That was the most expensive Senate race in the country, even though they didn't want these groups spending on their behalf from outside the state. So it just shows how hard it is to keep the money from kind of coming in. One of the interesting things that I think is interesting about 2012 that speaks to this trade-off between advertising and get out the vote. Obviously, I think a lesson the Republican Party has learned now is they're back to being the underdog and get out the vote again. And I think one of the things that Saj's book makes clear is just how much the Democratic Party has built up an advantage on this issue that's going to be a challenge for the Republican Party to catch up to or overcome. So my anticipation is in a campaign, as Lynn said, you're going to see the sort of lion's share of the resources devoted to advertising. It's just expensive to do, and candidates are afraid not to do it. But in between elections, in these interim cycles, right, the Democrats have built up this apparatus to do this kind of get-out-the-vote experimentation and testing and learning. You should see the Republican Party start to do that as well. And one of the other things that I think the Romney campaign said to us, one member of the Romney campaign said to us was, he said, I don't think an incumbent president's ever going to lose again because they have so much time to build this campaign and build this organization. It took Obama almost 2 years to do what he did in 2012, and the Romney campaign had about 6 months after the primary was over. And so I think for parties, their incentives have to be to invest technology and learning outside of an election cycle and spend money to do that. And so you might actually see some of the allocation of resources to GOTV and to field organization go on outside of a campaign cycle, both to generate knowledge and to develop an apparatus that you can then kick into gear once it's time to do so. Yeah. Scott?
I have a question about the advertising effect. Because it's a little stunning in some sense that we don't see any movement at all, even with this. We should at least see some, changes in the underlying justification for things. Like so, if I'm a Democrat and the Democrats are making particular type of argument, I should at least be accepting that, right? Confirming my bias or something. And everything just seems really stable. And so I'm wondering, and you have to talk a little bit outside of your data on this, is it possible that there has been a change in the advertising content strategies, right? So they're really aimed more at keeping the partisans home, right? And in this case, you already know that you've got a on-the-ground advantage. What you're trying to do is not bring in necessarily new voters or going out on a limb to bring in undecideds or anything like it. It's just to motivate. Have we seen some sort of difference here versus maybe some of the earlier?
No, I think the content is it's all the same. It's all electioneering, and I've watched all the ads, so they're pretty typical. And I think though the thing that you're like, oh, we would expect to see effects. Well, there are effects. If you can double your opponent's advantage, you can gain 2 points. So there are effects. We're finding effects. It's just that those size imbalances don't happen in very many places, and those effects don't last very long in the places where the imbalance happens.
Well, I guess I'm thinking in the underlying justifications the voters have, why there aren't, so I get the spending part of it kind of argument. It just seems a little puzzling to me that we don't see a shift in what the voters are thinking in terms of the.
We haven't fully finished this story. I think one of the things that's on our list to do more with, we've looked at the relationship between economic perceptions and the vote, right? We can look at the relationship between other kinds of impressions or the candidates or other kinds of issues, for example, to see, or just demographic attributes of voters. And these things might be what the messaging of the candidates is also activating. So, we're curious, for example, about whether the Obama attacks on Romney related to contraception and Planned Parenthood. There were several ads that he ran. And then, of course, the Republican Party that helped themselves with comments about rape by the Senate candidates and the Binders of Women comment that got lots of sort of humor. Does that mean that women or single women or who are the sort of target group is? Do they change as a consequence of this, right? Even if that's not going to, so underneath, again, the sort of steady state might be some interesting changes that are going on that wouldn't necessarily mean that absent this attack on Romney's position on contraception, Obama was going to lose single women, right, who are already a pretty Democratic-leaning constituency, but maybe something about those ads help to reinforce their preference for him or to make them more enthusiastic about voting. We're going to look for some of these kinds of more subtle effects. Because I don't think Len and I want to come away and say, look, 2 lines, never moving, we should just, we can all go home and think about things. I think there are potentially some more subtle things happening.
Well, part of the reason I ask is I think it has a lot to do with how voters then are going to react to the next period of governance, right? If you sort of heighten particular concerns, prime certain issues, and then you don't do anything about it, that's different than if, it doesn't really matter what you're talking about, and therefore you're unconstrained basically by the campaign when you govern, right? So I think a little bit about Obama, has clearly been more liberal in the first, 2 months. It's early to tell. He seems like a lot more like the progressive we thought we were going to get in 2008. But now he's actually being that guy, and I'm wondering if, I don't know, I'm not making a lot of sense.
Well, I think so. What this to me gets at is we may not be able to show that Obama doing a quasi-dream act for Latinos who were brought to this country as children and giving them this opportunity perhaps to stay. Or, that was like June or July 15th, I can't remember. We may not be able to show a lot of significant change in the way the Latinos felt about Obama in the wake of that. And it may be hard for us to trace the impact of that decision all the way to November. But one of the things that's true is that politicians learn their own lessons from election outcomes, separate from, strangely enough, separate from what social scientists say. It's almost like they don't read us, and that's relevant. Actually, this gets to what people like Ryan and Sasha can discover for us, since they can talk to these people and we can't. It seems that one thing that Barack Obama learned, or believes he learned, is that the election gave him some space to push on a couple of fronts. Immigration reform, right, works because it seems like Republicans believe that their weakness with Latinos was a major problem in 2012 and will be a bigger problem going forward. So that may have nothing to do with what Obama did during the campaign, but the fact that that's what they think the campaign did and what the campaign meant changes the way that they think about governing the country, their willingness perhaps to come together and compromise on immigration reform. We'll see. Gun control was obviously created by an event that no one could anticipate. But I think for us in the conclusion of the book, as we're sort of trying to think about the implications of the election, we want to distinguish a political science interpretation of the election, which says be very careful in assuming that the reason you won is because voters agree with you. But it may be the case that if politicians think that Obama won because voters agree with him on some issues, then you might start to see politicians adjust their behavior accordingly. And there may be some signals that Republicans are starting to do that, at least on some issues, at least in the short term.
It's we're wrapping up, running out of time. I'd like to thank John and Lynn one more time. Everyone else who presented today, the questions we've had, it's been a good day so far. 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 It's been a good day.